Tucker Carlson, as we were talking about yesterday and as we were predicting, is interviewing Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia who has launched this invasion of Ukraine, which has killed hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds, thousands of people. And Tucker wants to interview him. And I want to listen to the logic behind him interviewing him, because personally, I think Tucker is one of the worst people possible to do this interview. And I've already given my reasons for it in another video, but I want to see his justification. And I will probably repeat a lot of the talking points I've said before, but maybe I'll bring in some new ones once I see what Tucker has to say for his justification as to why he, of all people, should be the one to interview Vladimir Putin, even though he has basically zero experience of the region, knowledge of Russian history, or knowledge around the war, and constantly gets stuff about the war wrong and even spreads misinformation about it. For example, for every one Russian soldier that dies, 7 Ukrainian soldiers die. He's pumped out those fake numbers, or what he said about the Novakhovka Dam explosion, or what he said about Christianity in Ukraine. Whatever it is, he has a record of either misinterpreting events and therefore displaying that misinterpretation to other people, or just blatantly spreading lies and propaganda. Whatever it is, whichever it is, depends on your interpretation of his intentions. I have been less charitable to him as of late, especially ever since that Viktor Orban interview, where this so-called anti-corruption activist bent over backwards for one of the most corrupt governments in Europe to try to portray them as beautiful and fantastic and so conservative because they're fighting the culture war. So you can ignore the corruption, so you can ignore the centralization of control of the press around himself. And as a supposed journalist, that's something that Tucker should care about. But I've already talked about this before, so let's see what Tucker's reasons are for interviewing Vladimir Putin.
We're in Moscow tonight. We're here to interview the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. We'll be doing that soon. There are risks to conducting an interview like this, obviously, so we've thought about it carefully over many months. Here's why we're doing it. First, because it's our job. We're in journalism. Our duty is to inform people. 2 years into a war that...
just throw out there again, that Tucker Carlson has very bad at informing people about this war. Whether it was him claiming that the Novakhovka Dam was destroyed by the Ukrainians, his mispublishing of just completely photoshopped and just fake numbers about death tolls, or just the general narratives he's been trying to push about the war, it comes from somebody who's tried to learn about the war basically overnight and has taken another establishment narrative. He didn't like the American establishment narrative about the war, so what he's done is simply just looked into the Russian establishment narrative, looked into their goodie basket, and started taking what he liked, like he did with those fake death numbers that he reported twice. That's right, twice on Fox News.
It's reshaping the entire world. Most Americans are not informed. They have no real idea what's happening in this region, here in Russia or 600 miles away in Ukraine. But they should know. They're paying for much of it in ways they might not fully yet perceive.
Not since October, actually no, September of last year, due to the efforts of brave allies of Tucker Carlson to stop us from upholding our commitment to defend Ukraine after they gave up their nuclear arsenal, the #1 guarantee of state sovereignty.
The war in Ukraine is a human disaster. It's left hundreds of thousands of people dead, an entire generation of young Ukrainians, and it's depopulated the largest country in Europe. But the long-term effects are even more profound. This war has utterly reshaped the global military and trade alliances, and the sanctions that followed have as well. And in total, they have upended the world economy.
I think he's exaggerating a little bit. I think the main areas of the world economy that were really hit by the Russian invasion of Ukraine would probably be the energy sector. People say that Russia is basically a country operating on a gas station, or what does they say? That's just a big old gas station. But you get the idea. It's like they just sell oil, and that's not completely true. But when it comes to a total percentage of your GDP, it is kind of true. And so the Russian energy sector and its exports to Europe, that took a major hit. And there was a reshaping of those energy markets. For example, the Germans are now heavily reliant on Norwegian exports and American LNG exports, helping the American LNG market so much that before we used to have 5 export terminals. We're building 6 more. We're more than doubling our export terminals. And we're exporting so much LNG and trying to expand our capacity so fast that Biden's actually put a pause on LNG expansion like a month ago because he's worried that we're making so many LNG centers, with the largest LNG export port being in construction right now and us more than doubling the amount of facilities we can use to export these goods, Biden's put a freeze on it because he's worried about the internal security of the American energy market if we just keep exporting all this LNG overseas. So there has been some reshifting, but I think sometimes people exaggerate it or try to put a lot of the economic troubles that Americans are feeling, whether it has to do with debt crisis, whether it has to do with the housing crisis, or completely unrelated economic effects, and trying to tie it to the war. And it is global. A war in Europe definitely has an effect on the United States. In fact, instability, economic instability, and geopolitical instability in Europe could have devastating consequences for the United States, as Europe is our #1 export market. And not only is Europe our #1 export market, they're also the second largest holder of world reserve currency. And if you combine them with the United States, they make up 45% of the world's economy. I mean, when it comes to their GDP, 45% of the world's economy, they're 45% of global GDP. So instability in Europe, while some people try to say, oh, this isn't an American concern, putting aside the fact that we all signed treaties making it so we would defend each other if we were attacked, and we summoned them to defend us after 9/11, and the Ukrainians went with us into Iraq and died in Iraq, gallivanting, looking for nuclear weapons. Point is, I'm getting a little bit off topic. This has had an effect on the world economy, but some people use this as a scapegoat for economic issues. Tucker, in my opinion, being one of those people.
The post-World War II economic order, the system that guaranteed prosperity in the West for more than 80 years, is coming apart very fast, and along with it, the dominance of the U.S. dollar.
See, this is again a jumping to conclusions thing that I really don't like from Tucker. I've talked about this before, but the U.S. dollar is not falling apart anytime soon, and it's not that I'm saying that the U.S. dollar is as powerful as it used to be, but there's no competitor. When they say the dominance of the U.S. dollar is falling, it is true that there's like organizations like BRICS that don't like the dominance of the U.S. dollar that much, but none of them have been able to put forward a competitor. There's no competitor to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar still makes up 59% of world reserve currency. The next biggest competitor, the euro. They make up like 20%. You want to know the biggest competitor after that? The Japanese yen, then the Canadian dollar. Then I think you get to the Chinese that make up 1 to 2%. The Russians want the ruble to be the competitor to the dollar. But the Russians also are artificially inflating the ruble, and nobody's going to use a currency that's artificially inflated or artificially controlled by the government in that way to be the world reserve currency. It's part of the same reason why nobody would really trust the Chinese currency in order to be, to be the world reserve currency, because they also have a lot of political controls on it. Point is, it's not that the US dollar is as strong as it used to be, but I think a lot of people are jumping the gun on this. And I'm not saying this because I want to fiercely defend the US dollar. It's just, it's like, for example, Putin is in a weaker spot in some ways than he's ever been. But if I was to ask you who replaced Putin, you would be like, I don't know. Now you can acknowledge that Putin's been in maybe a weaker spot than he's ever been. But if there's nobody to take his place, then Russians feel like they don't even have another option. And so my question would be for this replacement for the US dollar, what is that alternative option? Some people are talking about making a competitor, and I'd be interested to hear it, but BRICS has yet to put one forward.
These are not small changes. They are history-altering developments. They will define the lives of our grandchildren. Most of the world understands this perfectly well. They can see it. Ask anyone in Asia or the Middle East what the future looks like. And yet the populations of the English-speaking countries seem mostly unaware. They think that as nothing has really changed. And they think that because no one has told them the truth. Their media outlets are corrupt. They lie to their readers and viewers. And they do that mostly by omission.
Man, that's beautiful. What's beautiful about this is I'm just listening to Tucker list off the reasons why I don't like his reporting. Like his history of lying about the war in Ukraine and about the events around it. Or the fact that he leaves out certain information in order to paint a story in a way he likes. For example, like his interview with that crack addict who said he had gay intercourse with Obama and then gave him no pushback whatsoever. By selectively choosing not to ask him any difficult questions to challenge him, like, don't you think you should have some evidence that any of these events happened? He's showing the audience a certain story, a story unchallenged. But if you started to challenge it, maybe it would start to fall apart. For example, when he said that the Novakhovka Dam explosion was most likely the Ukrainians, Did he include the fact that the Russians occupy the Novakhovka Dam explosion, that it was created during the Cold War to sustain nuclear explosions? That's true, by the way. It was created to sustain nuclear explosions. So it would be kind of difficult for the Ukrainians just to, aim like an artillery gun at it and go kablamo. Not saying it's impossible, but you'd be able to look at it and see the dam and be, oh, yes, it looks like this was fired upon by some missile, by some artillery gun. There's no signs of that. And in fact, architects say that the destruction of the Novakhovka Dam, when you look at it, it's destruction that could have only been done from inside the dam. And this was even said once on Russian state TV, and Russian state TV commentators once being told that by a Russian architect, one that must have somehow ended up the program without being told. You had to say it was the Ukrainians. The host then had to do backflips to try to explain how it was still the Ukrainians. He said, well, maybe the Ukrainians put on diving suits and put on air containers and swam up the river and then snuck into the building with hundreds of pounds of explosives on their back while swimming somehow. And then it was, I'm not saying we know for 100% it was the Novakhovka Dam explosion, but by him just saying, oh, the Ukrainians have interest to do this and not showing any of the other information or not correcting anything after the fact, he is lying by omission.
For example, since the day the war in
Eris, thank you so much for the tier 1.
Ukraine began.
By the way, for example, since the day the war in Ukraine began, I would usually not mention this, but he is in Russia. Do you think he doesn't want to say Russian invasion of Ukraine or Russian war in Ukraine because of Russian law? Or is this just always how he said it? I don't know. Either way, very neutral language.
American media outlets have spoken to scores of people from Ukraine, and they've done scores of interviews with Ukrainian President Zelensky. We ourselves have put in a request for an interview with Zelensky, and we hope he accepts. But the interviews he's already done in the United States are not traditional interviews. They are fawning pep sessions specifically designed to amplify Zelensky's demand that the U.S. enter more deeply into a war in Eastern Europe and pay for it.
That's not true. I've seen a lot of interviews where they start to ask him, like, where a lot of people ask, oh, do you think you should give up this land? Do you think you should give up that? Do you think it's time to negotiate? Maybe it's time for you to give this up. I've seen those interviews. I've seen those interviews before. It depends on the outlet that's interviewing him. But it is true that the Western media outlets do kind of like Zelensky. That is true. But the idea that he's just completely fawned over in all of these interviews, I've seen Zelensky get angry in interviews before. I'm trying to remember if it was The Economist or the Financial Times. It might have been Politico.
That is not journalism. It is government propaganda. Propaganda of the ugliest kind, the kind that kills people. At the same time, our politicians...
He didn't explain how it kills people. He just said it did. He expected us to understand or make the connection. I think the connection is, oh, we're lying us into a war, therefore it kills people. But I will say also, cutting off an ally from aid that is using to defend itself from an invading neighbor, which then leads to them taking higher casualties, losing more land, and getting in range in major cities with artillery guns, and then firing those major cities, as they're doing right now in Kherson, that also kills people. And if you kick the can down the road, as has been done for the last 8 years preceding the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, that killed people too. 200 rounds of negotiations. 220 negotiated ceasefires.
Politicians and media outlets have been doing this, promoting a foreign leader like he's a new consumer brand.
Again, it's not that they're promoting a foreign leader like he's a consumer brand. People had no clue who Zelensky was outside of when he got elected. People were like, oh, wasn't he a movie star who got elected and he played president on TV? Now he is the president, haha, and that's it. Nobody else knew who he was. And people started to learn who he was. That was the press job, to teach them who he was. Everyone knew who Putin was. Not everybody knew who Zelensky was. Not only did not everybody know who Zelensky was, but then it became the largest war in Europe since World War II. Yeah, Americans are going to learn a little bit about Winston Churchill, the leader of Poland, the leader of France, at the outset of a major war. They're going to learn a lot. They might even talk to them, might even listen to them, especially if our support is going over there. And it feels like, I mean, under Putin, under his logic, we should at least listen to the guy as to why he wants us to send his support over.
Single Western journalist has bothered to interview the president of the other country involved in this conflict, Vladimir Putin.
Now, this is an interesting line. Let's hear this one more time.
At the same time, our politicians and media outlets have been doing this, promoting a foreign leader like he's a new consumer brand. Not a single Western journalist has bothered to interview the president of the other country involved in this conflict, Vladimir Putin.
Now, what's interesting about this is, while technically true, even though there's certain press conferences where like 1 or 2 questions will be thrown at him, Barbara Waters and others have interviewed Putin before. But as for post-Russian invasion of Ukraine interviews, that is true, we haven't got any. But the reason we haven't got any isn't because any Western journalist hasn't bothered, or the way he's painting it. Has he asked around? Does he know the local media scene in Russia and whether or not they're trying to interview Putin, the Western journalists over there? There have been Western journalists trying to interview Putin. In fact, where is it? Here it is. Here's Steve Rosenberg. He's a reporter for BBC. He did that report recently at a Putin election party where he's talking to the top Russian propagandists and asking them about the war, and they were just collapsing under his most basic questioning. It's kind of embarrassing, really. He has responded to this claim from Tucker Carlson by saying, interesting to hear Tucker Carlson claim that no Western journalist has bothered to interview Putin since the invasion of Ukraine. We've lodged several requests with the Kremlin in the last 18 months. Always a no from us. Why would Tucker Carlson say no, 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 no to all the other Western journalists who have been asking to interview Putin, but he would say yes to an interview with Tucker Carlson? Probably because they believe the interview would be conducted differently. The interview might be softer, might give Putin more leeway, or possibly no pushback at all. So there have been journalists trying to do it. It's just that the Russians have said no, because the Russians probably came to the conclusion that an interview with the BBC would come with questions like, you continue to deny that the slaughter at Bucha was committed by the Russian army. Here's videos and photos and all this. You guys say it's fake. How do you know it's fake? Prove it. Or something along those lines. Will Tucker ask that type of a question? That type of a question in Russia could quite literally get you in prison. In fact, there are multiple journalists right now, if we're going to talk about Western journalists, and they're afraid to interview Putin. They won't do it. What about the Western journalists that are in prison right now and have been in prison for over 100 days? This is American journalist. This one has been locked up for 100 days. He's a journalist with the Wall Street Journal. Here's another one that's been locked up for quite a while now. I'm trying to remember her name. I know I have it written down somewhere, but Koromasovia. I think I pronounced this slightly wrong, but this is a Voice of America reporter. These are 2 Russian-American journalists that are in Russia right now, sitting in prison cells due to their reporting on the war. Now, Tucker Carlson, he has done, plenty of interviews with, talking about Gonzalo Lira, talking about Gonzalo Lira's father, talking about the horrible crimes done upon him. But then when he goes to a country, Russia, which currently has journalists for doing journalism, not for lying about Bucha or just doing like internet blogging in favor of the war, but for doing actual journalism, they're sitting in a prison cell, and he's just disregarding the work of people like that who've been arrested for trying to challenge the government, or at least report on the government honestly, or all the other reporters who are trying to interview Putin, trying to interview the Russian president, but they're denying it. Again, it's just, he needs to be special. He needs to be the brave one. He's the only one who would interview Putin because he's a brave truth teller. The reason why the Russians want him over the other guy is because that reporter, the other one that's been trying to get it for 18 months, he understands the history of Russia. He understands the history of the region. He understands a lot of the motivations between the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he has knowledge, and he can speak the language. So why would they accept Tucker over him? Because Tucker is an easier interviewer. It's because Tucker won't push back, and because Tucker doesn't know the history. So when Putin starts saying, oh, NATO agreed not to expand, or NATO did this, or NATO did that, or actually the Chechen bombings were, or really, he's not going to have any idea on how to push back. He's going to have no idea what to do. That's why he's a perfect interview subject.
Most Americans have no idea why.
I mean, the perfect interviewer for him.
Most Americans have no idea why Putin invaded Ukraine or what his goals are now. They've never heard his voice.
Here he is at the start of the war. This was broadcasted on many news outlets. This one has over 823,000 views. This was a few days before the invasion. This is the 45-minute speech. I think the full thing's actually over an hour long of Vladimir Putin
support our
translated into English. Just saying, with no critique, no anything, his reason for invading. That was at the start of the war. Here's another one with CNN at the Victory Day parade that they translated his speech. Here's another one. This is from 11 months ago. This was his annual speech to the Russian General Assembly. It was translated by the Telegraph, viewed by 580,000 people. These are just a few outlets. If you want to listen to Putin, if you want to type in Putin speech translated or Putin why he says he invaded Ukraine, you can go look at his speech from the start of the war. In fact, you can read his essays leading up to the war, where he calls Ukraine artificial, what he calls Ukraine like it can only exist as part of Russia, as an extension of Russia, saying that Ukraine has to exist subjugated to Russia. Outside of it, it cannot exist. Imperial language. Or you could look at, point is, you can listen to Putin. There's plenty of opportunities to listen to Putin, plenty of material online.
That's wrong. Americans have a right to know all they can about a war they're implicated in, and we have the right to tell them about it because we are Americans too. Freedom of speech is our birthright. We were born with the right to say what we believe. That right cannot be taken away no matter who is in the White House.
No one is saying that it's illegal for him to interview Vladimir Putin. I just think it's a terrible idea because he'll do a terrible job. And it'll just end up being a puff piece. And all it's going to do is give more people in the right-wing base reasons to love this authoritarian, anti-free speech, anti-judicial independence, anti-freedom president invading Ukraine in large part because Ukraine wants to move towards a system that is ideologically closer to us and move into the European Union and evolve past the oligarchical system that has been built in Russia, the same corruption that Tucker Carlson constantly lambasts.
But they're trying anyway. Almost 3 years ago, the Biden administration illegally spied on our text messages and then leaked the contents to their servants in the news media. They did this in order to stop a Putin interview that we were planning.
We don't know that. We don't know that the Biden administration leaked it. Do we know this? Is this public knowledge? I've never heard this before. Maybe, you know what? I'll Google it off screen right now. Did Biden administration spies on Tucker Carlson? Or is this just another Tucker claim? No, it looks like this claim is now... Okay, so this is back from 2021. Tucker Carlson claims the NSA is spying on him. Even his own colleagues don't seem to believe... Okay, well, damn.
What?
And I just got an article from Reuters saying U.S. intelligence agency say it isn't spying on Tucker Carlson. Well, the spies said they're not spying. That's the end of that.
Last month, we're pretty certain they did exactly the same thing once again. But this time, we came to Moscow anyway. We are not here because we love Vladimir Putin. We are here because we love the United States.
Ah, yes. That's why he's going to take the opportunity in the interview to ask him to release those jailed American journalists, like he marched around for Gonzalo Lira, the red pill sex pest internet blogger.
We want it to remain prosperous and free. We paid for this trip ourselves. We took no money from any government or group. Nor are we charging people to see the interview. It is not behind a paywall. Anyone can watch the entire thing, shot live to tape and unedited, on our website, tuckercarlson.com. Elon Musk, to his great credit, has promised not to suppress or block this interview once we post it on his platform, X, and we're grateful for that. Western governments, by contrast, will certainly do their best to censor this video on other less principled platforms.
Dude, there are interviews of Vladimir Putin available right now on YouTube of Barbara Waters interviewing him. His whole invasion speech is available publicly on Sky News on YouTube, not only on Sky News, but on other platforms as well. Publicly available. I can go and I can read his essays from before the war, explaining how Ukraine is cringe and needs to die or whatever. I can, like, it's all publicly available.
Because that's what they do. They are afraid of information they can't control. But you have no reason to be afraid of it. We are not encouraging you to agree with what Putin may say in this interview, but we are urging you to watch it. You should know as much as you
Well, watch our interview. Watch us. The constant desire of the content creator.
can. And then, like a free citizen and not a slave, you can decide for yourself. Thanks.
This is going to be a shit interview. This is going to be terrible. It's going to be awful. So, Mr. Putin, so you're saying that actually the whole war is Ukraine's fault? Wow. Never thought of it like that way before. Oh my. Interesting. Oh, also, I do want to throw out there, if you want an idea of the type of commentary you're going to get from Tucker in this interview, or why I particularly don't trust him to do it, watch this.
Why do I?
By the way, yes, it's MSNBC. I'm livid out.
Over and over and over again. Why do I care what's going on in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? And I'm serious. Like, why do I care? Tell you why. And why shouldn't I root for Russia, which I am?
Could any of these people actually...
Why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am. Just to, you know, somebody might say it's back from 2019, but I would counter that by saying...
got a tier 1 subscription. F***CK Putin.
I agree, but I would counter that by saying it was also bad for them to invade back in 2014, and the Russians were also bad back there as well.
Tell you why Vladimir Putin is so bad. Why is he so bad? He's bad! I think we should probably take the side of Russia if we have to choose between Russia and Ukraine. That is my view. It might be worth asking yourself, since it is getting pretty serious, what is this really about? Why do I hate Putin so much? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? So why does permanent Washington hate him so much? If you've been watching the news, you know that Putin is having a border dispute with a nation called Ukraine.
Border dispute. Border dispute. I love that neutral language. Of course he was the person invited over. He's yelling, yes, I support the Russians. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Dude, Dylan keeps asking for serious thumbnails in his live right now YouTube streams. My response, live now on YouTube. Yeah, but I straight up told Danabo at one point, like, you know, eventually, like, if I'm on stream and I'm talking about my friends getting shot or something, and this is the type of thumbnail it's going to be on, I'm going to get really pissed.